Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Voices of Music Therapy podcast. I am not your host, Brian Locascio. Instead, we're changing things up a bit this week. My name is Alec Henn, and I am the editor for Voices of Music Therapy. I'm a video and audio editor from Kansas City, Missouri, and I'm now living and working in San Diego. I've been fortunate enough to be involved with this podcast since the very beginning. So if you are happy with the quality of the show, please feel free to leave us a comment on social media, YouTube, wherever, and let us know that you like our work. If you aren't happy with the quality of the show, just keep it to yourself. So, you may be asking, why am I hosting today's show? And I would love to explain. Today's guest is a board-certified music therapist who received his Bachelor of Music in Music Therapy degree from the University of Kansas in 2020. In undergraduate studies, he gained experience working with populations such as premature infants, early language learners, pediatric medical, at-risk youth, adult oncology, incarcerated adults, and older adult memory care. He received the E. Thayer Gaston Award while at the University of Kansas for outstanding facilitation and participated in research while in his undergrad and presented at the Midwest Regional Conference. After graduating, he relocated to San Diego for internship and provided music therapy services to local hospital systems, both adult and pediatric, partnered with the LGBT Community Center in San Diego, and continued serving several other sites and populations. He currently works in pediatric home care and hospice, and with teens with traumatic backgrounds. Let's give a warm welcome to our guest, Brian Locascio.
Hello. I'm happy to be here.
How does it feel to be on the other side?
It's weird. It's not something that I was anticipating this soon, but I'm really happy that we're here and that we get to have this discussion.
And that brings us into our topic and title of today's episode, Voice of the Creator. And one of the first things that you always ask on this show is, how do you define music therapy?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, so this will be a really hard question for me, primarily because when I think about music therapy, every day that I learn something new, my definition for it changes. And so mindfully, when I ask this question, I also don't necessarily have a rigid definition for it myself. But I think the standard, it's a therapeutic modality. Like music therapy is a therapeutic process that involves a clinician and a client that's board certified, and is facilitated in a way that achieves goals that can be musical or non-musical. I think it's important to include both the education towards music education in itself kind of lent itself towards people thinking, we should separate ourselves from that. So in music therapy, we used to say non-music goals, but I think it's important to include music goals because creating music, writing music, listening to music is in itself a coping skill that is very useful. So by that definition, I would say to achieve musical, non-musical goals while allowing the client to reach the best version of their self that they would like to achieve.
Excellent. And what led you to this profession?
Oh, what led me to the profession? Wow. That's a lot. I would say the biggest thing that led me to this profession was seeing that there was a need in the world for mental health focus and for self-expression. And I think growing up in the Midwest, moving to California, kind of getting to travel and see different cultures and different worldviews, I really started to see that there is a lot of focus towards like physical needs, but there's really not a lot towards mental health. And that shift in the US has just been happening within the last couple decades. So I wanted to be a part of that change and to support people in ways that music can allow that other modalities of therapy cannot reach as effectively.
Gotcha. So kind of going off of that, what does the practice look like for you currently? Obviously, things have been different over the last year, and you essentially had to finish your internship and start working during the pandemic, right?
Yeah, so I was 3 months into my 6-month internship when COVID lockdown began in California, which was a big culture shift in terms of how we provide therapy. We had to look at what was ethical through telehealth services. HIPAA compliance changed as a result of that. And for those who don't know, HIPAA is basically our governing body for most mental health and most/all mental health professions and medical healthcare. Essentially, it's the governing body for client confidential information and maintaining those standards. And essentially those all had to be reworked while I was learning how to be a professional in music therapy at the same time. So I had to shift mentally towards what therapy would look like. I had to learn new technology really quickly. I mean, we were on our computers every day, but I'd never used it as the modality for therapy. So that was new. And what it came down to was I was kind of thrown out of all the settings that I was working with originally. I'd just begun my time at the pediatric hospital, and I'd been serving at the adult hospital for several months, as well as just beginning my case study with first responders in person. And when that hit, everything went virtual. And instead of getting to see individual clients one by one for pediatric home care, we ended up seeing like groups for cardiac units and things like that. And for first responders, instead of having that collaborative like drum circle experience where individuals could come up and lead the group and they could support each other, it became virtual, which is very hard because anybody who's doing music virtually knows that making music live as a group at the same time is extremely difficult over Zoom or over any type of telehealth software.
Yeah. So it sounds like really no one obviously had any plans in place for something like that to strike. But when it did, it sounds like everyone kind of had to figure out how to adapt as all of that was going. And that does seem like a very important trait for music therapists to have, is to be able to adapt and overcome certain challenges like that to get the work done. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, every single day there's adaptations, whether it's going to be functionally for our therapeutic goals or just in us like getting through the day. It could be through like waking up earlier so that you have extra time to prep a session, or making a session last a little bit longer because a client is going through a traumatic episode and they need to be talked out of it before you conclude the session. So that was very difficult. And transitioning into the professional world was even harder because I only had 3 months in the professional world for what it looked like prior to COVID. And once everything hit, all these private practices were like, oh, we're no longer in person. There goes our main income. We're no longer hiring. And I was looking at a lot of private practices as well as hospitals. Obviously, the hospitals were shut down because they were overflowing with COVID cases. They were like, we need to focus on maintaining the staff that we have and keeping them safe before we hire anyone new. And budgets were going to that instead, getting PPE and things like that. So finding a job was also really difficult and stressful, and something that, although I think people know, it's not mentioned a whole lot for people in my age group that were in the middle of the pandemic when transitioning to the professional world, or began in the pandemic and ended in the pandemic.
And so now that you have adapted and adjusted how to practice music therapy in this current climate, tell me a little bit about where you're working now, because you got hired at the same place that you did your internship, correct?
Yes. So I'm working at a private practice in San Diego, serving the whole metropolitan area. And since getting hired, I have been serving pediatric hospice, like you said in my intro there, as well as just pediatric home care. At the beginning of me working, what I had to do was transition to telehealth. So all of those in-home sessions moved to online. A lot of my clients were put on pause, which is very common and something that I've seen among other professionals as well. And now that we're kind of slowly phasing out of our strict precautions for now, I will say, what we begin to see is that we can go in-home. So there's 3 levels that we have been phasing back in. During COVID, The first level was just doing through telehealth. And so I would talk to these parents, and it was so difficult because I wasn't able to actually demonstrate for them ways that they could engage with their child through music. And the great part about this is that it made us rethink, what our role is too in music therapy. Or for me, it made me rethink that too, and how I could have the parent really provide therapy to their child through me. And after that, we went to our phase 2, which was being able to provide services at the client's homes, but it had to be outdoors in a secure location for confidentiality's sake. And that was really interesting too, because although we were in person, we still couldn't do like hand over hand demonstrations for them. And we still had to remain 6 feet apart. So it's so funny to see how involved like in-person things are, just from handing an instrument to somebody all the way to, giving them an example by playing a beat and then holding their hand if they need that extra motor support and having them play that beat. Without being able to do that was just a whole new change. And so we finally entered our third stage, which is where we are now. And in our third stage, we are able to go in-home while maintaining our mask and face shield precautions, as well as sanitizing all instruments and washing our hands in between, before and after every session, which is what we did for all the phases. And it's been a change, but it's a great learning curve. And I think it's going to make me, as well as other music therapists, really, really prepared for anything in the future.
Well, that's good to hear. I obviously am not a music therapist and can't really speak on the intricacies and everything that's involved with, sort of transitioning back to a normal way of practicing. But it does sound like a very effective way, that sort of 3-step process of phasing back into doing more in person, with, select clients, and being able to adjust and be able to help them in whatever ways possible, as long as it's safe. So it's nice to hear that you guys are making progress on that front. But speaking of the work that you do and the way you're going about it, I'd like to ask you another question that you love to ask people on this show. And what is it that you do to contribute to the world of music therapy? And in what ways do you innovate?
Mm-hmm. The question's much harder when it's turned around. Oh, gosh. I think the biggest way that each of us, including myself, can be innovative is through the continuation of learning. And I think that's part of the whole idea behind the show too, is that I want to provide opportunities for myself to grow, because the more we know, the more we can innovate, right? We set a standard for what there is to know. And as we gain more information through research, through conferences, etc., we're gaining this knowledge and our threshold rises. And so for me, my innovation comes through actively seeking those opportunities to learn. And it's not something that nobody else is doing, but it's something that makes me and music therapists as a whole better at what we do. So I think that's my main thing. I also have participated in research for premature infants and sound levels and preventing harm in the NICU, but that is not published yet. So for now, we'll go with my first answer.
So it sounds like the whole reason then for starting the podcast was just so you could learn more.
Definitely, it's an opportunity to learn. I think I'm very straightforward with that in the show.
And since we're speaking about the podcast, why did you want to be an interviewee on the show so early on in its run?
That's a really good question. I want to be transparent in many ways. That's kind of my biggest thing within the podcast. The first thing I'd like to say is that my intention behind making it so early on is not to showcase me. That's never been a goal of mine with this show. It is to showcase other people from a variety of identities and backgrounds who are experts in their field, and to really showcase them and make their research and information accessible. So that's the first thing I'd like to say to answer your question. The second thing is that I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to get to know me and my background in order to better understand why I facilitate the show the way that I do. And In better understanding me, I think you can also better understand the guests that I've chosen, where I'm coming from when I ask questions, and so that you can better gauge whether this show is something that you would like to continue to support based on not only the content that we release, but the people behind the content. And thirdly, scheduling's hard, especially in a pandemic. And it just so worked out that we had an opening and here I am. So I want to be transparent about that too.
Excellent. And kind of going back to that point about letting people get to know you and kind of your background, where you're coming from, specifically with the interviewees you have and the questions you ask, it made me think about the first episode that we did, which was about identity and authenticity. You just mentioned that you were wanting to, tell your listeners a little bit more about who you are as a person and let them know where you're coming from when it comes to the questions you ask and the people you interview. And I just kept thinking of that first episode about identity. So I think it'd be nice if you were able to tell your listeners a little bit about your identity and how you go about practicing and taking your identity into a session with you so that you can be your truest self and use that as a means to support your clients.
Wow. Yeah. That's a really big question. I guess I'll just start from all my intersecting identities and we can kind of go from there. So I'm coming to you as an able-bodied white man, middle class, came from a Midwest background, Christian, and at the same time, I have these other identities as well, which are queer, newly found, neurodiverse, I guess. I was always neurodiverse. I just didn't have a word for that. And really just a new professional. Obviously, there's many, many more identities, but that's kind of where I'm coming from. And so I have a lot of privilege and I carry a lot of privilege with me and in the ways that I am perceived. And in that way, I am very mindful within sessions, within meetings, within any type of social situation of the power that privilege holds. And it's something that I'm learning more about. Thanks to all these creators in the past year and who have worked their whole lifetimes to advocate for BIPOC voices and the trans community and anybody who's not cis, who have really lent a voice to showing that privilege that I'm talking about. I'm learning more about how I can use that to support those individuals. And it is a learning process. I'm not perfect and I make mistakes all the time, but it's the fact that we're working towards something. And I think that is what I bring to sessions is that, hey, I'm going to make mistakes, but know that they're not intentional. I am here to support you. I'm going to do my research ahead of time to minimize the amount of mistakes I make. And once I'm called out, I'm going to make an action plan for fixing those mistakes. And those are a big part of my identity. Is there any of those identities that you want to hear more about?
Yeah, I think that it'd be kind of nice to break up the different identities you talk about and speak on how each one affects your practice as a music therapist.
So the first is white, which is the main demographic of music therapists. And so in being white, I talked about privilege and knowing that when I go into a space that is, let's say, all people of color, or all Black individuals, or all, you name it, anything that's not white, essentially. I know that the dynamic's going to be different than if I represented, as a therapist, the population that I'm serving. And as a white person, when I go into these spaces that are filled with people of color, or any type of situation that's not filled with all white people, that I'm going to be perceived differently as a white music therapist with those populations than a therapist that represents those communities. And that could potentially affect how fast we build rapport, what the clients feel comfortable disclosing, and more. So those are things that I keep in mind as far as identity as a therapist. As a person on this show, that was also a big part, is that, hey, I'm a white guy. And most music therapists are white women. That's the dominant part of this mental health field and this Western idea of therapy. And so by providing an opportunity to showcase other voices, that's a way of me using my privilege and accessibility to all these platforms and recording and knowing how to use software and lending that to communities that may not have been raised with that same level of privilege.
That's wonderful. When it comes to a situation like that, you mentioned trying to build rapport. And in what ways do you overcome that and, still work towards building a solid relationship with a client when you feel that there might be some hesitation?
Yeah, I would definitely say acknowledging any type of awkwardness or discomfort and being transparent. One of the biggest things I like to do is just to get to know people. Like, they're people, everybody has these backgrounds that influence their thoughts, their feelings, how they present themselves in the world, but just getting to know them. And that's the thing. You just get to know people. And I use them, and that makes it sound like us and them mentality. And that's not what I mean to do. But I mean to show that it is a relationship. And with any relationship, you have to get to know the other person to build it. And you have to be open to that. And so I will learn new music that I may have never had the experience with. And that's just a way musically that I can help build that rapport with a client. I'll listen to their perspectives, and I'm not going to insert my opinions. It's not my place most of the time. And I'll just create an open, safe space. I guess that's kind of cliche, but it's what it is.
Wonderful. So on the flip side of that, in a situation like that where you're working to overcome maybe some preconceived differences between you and a client, on the flip side, you talked about working with LGBT plus populations and that you identify as queer. Does that, I guess, in a sense, help build relationships? Does it help solidify a bond that you may already be able to relate to a client if that's the situation you're working in?
That's an interesting question. I would definitely say that when I'm working with queer clients, disclosing that I'm also queer has an innate bond to it, only because we have shared experiences that are essential to the queer coming out, discovering yourself journey that we all go through. So in that way, personal disclosure can be therapeutically effective. We talk about gauging how much to disclose about yourself. But I think when you work with individuals who are queer and you're talking about queer topics and you are also queer, that is something that is going to help a client trust you. Now, if you have like queer phobia or like homophobia or transphobia or anything like that, that's for the individual and the therapist to gauge for themselves. But for me, it has been beneficial. Also keeping in mind that if I have clients who have adverse reactions to those kinds of things, that I will not disclose that information. And so that's something that you have to gauge as a music therapist and learn over time, is how to negotiate which identities to present with while still balancing authenticity.
So I'm just kind of drawing a connection here then that, usually on your show, you interview people and talk to them about a sort of specialty that they practice in or that they research, any situation like that. Would your identity and the people that you work with, would you count that as like a sort of specialty of yours? Or is there anything else that you would say is a specialty of yours in the settings that you work in or the practices that you do?
I think it's pretty early on for me to say I have a specialty. There are areas that I have more experience in, and those queer populations would certainly be an area that I have done a lot of research in and have that experience behind, as well as premature infants in the NICU. However, I can't say that they're a specialty, because I think for me, my definition of specialty has years of experience and research behind it. And so I think it's an area that I focus on, and these are areas that I focus on, but I wouldn't say I have a specialty.
What are some things about you that you would like to share with your listeners? Anything that may be something that they don't know about you, something they may not expect? I think this would be a wonderful time to kind of tell them just a little bit about some lesser known facts about Brian Locascio.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yes. I would say that I have a lot of things that I'd like the listeners to know. One of the things is that when I'm not doing a podcast, I also create music. So I've released several EPs and singles in my lifetime, and I plan on doing more. And that's something that I love to pursue, as well as acting in opera. That's kind of like within the musical realm, right? But outside of the musical realm, I have a real affinity towards nature in general, which is cliche, but I have a big thing with like flowers, and I love the process of taking care of flowers and seeing them in bloom, and it's just really enjoyable for me. This sounds really stupid.
I don't think so.
I also want individuals to know that I touched on being neurodiverse, and I kind of just left it there. So my official diagnosis that I've had since I was, I don't know, like 6 or something, maybe even younger, is ADHD. And so that's been a journey in how to cope with having ADHD and still be able to, do all these projects that I have. And I think that the voices of those with ADHD are often disregarded in some sense because it's a less noticeable. Let's say it's a less externally noticeable diagnosis, unless of course you're like hopping around as a kid. But as an adult, it really has a lot more internal symptoms, such as having trouble focusing. Classic. That's the attention part of it. But then in addition, what your focusing looks like, in what capacity, for how long, and adjusting that to a rigid structure of the workforce. And so these are things that I've had to navigate in my life, and luckily have successfully done so and going to continue doing so. But it's something that I want people to know. If I come at a question in an interesting way, it could just be my personality, or it could be my way of thinking as a result of my diagnosis.
Yeah, I think that's really cool that you're able to, share that and kind of offer some insight into the way you think, the way you perceive things. And I think that's really cool to share with your listeners. We also talked a little bit there about some of the projects you do, like the podcast, and I would love to dive into that a little deeper right after this break. And welcome back to the Voices of Music Therapy podcast. I am still not your host, Brian Locascio, but fortunately we have him on with us as our guest today. My name is Alec, Henn. I'm usually the editor, but we're changing things up a bit. So we're going to jump right back in with Mr. Licacio as we talk about the podcast itself and kind of how it came about. So, Brian, if you would like to speak on that, I really just think it'd be good to throw out there why you started a podcast and why specifically you chose that as the format you wanted to use to cover topics in the realm of music therapy.
So for the podcast, and thank you for that lovely introduction. For the podcast, my idea behind the way it's structured and having our guests on is I want to create an opportunity for these resources that are often like gatekept and separated from the general population to be accessible. So in that way, I'm doing research. I'm reading all these articles that the public might not have access to because of database reasons, etc. And I'm getting this really highly educated like wording, and I'm trying to break it down to be accessible and easy to listen to on a walk while driving to work, whatever your time is that you like to listen to podcasts. And so I wanted to do it in a way that could be approachable while lending itself to daily lives, because we're all busy. We all have 1,000 different things we're doing. We don't have time to sit down and read a 30-page article every day. That's just not feasible for everyone. So my idea behind the podcast is to take all this difficult information to comprehend in a short amount of time, paired with the person who wrote this information or the editor of this information, to allow them to explain it in an approachable way as well. And so that's why I have these interviews. It also helps us to get to know therapists and educators and professionals as people. Like I've said several times, we have all these different parts of our lives, and it's easy to put somebody on a pedestal, but knowing that they're people allows us to realize that that is approachable for us to achieve as well. Anybody is capable of achieving the things that they set their mind to. So that is why it's an interview-based podcast.
And so, of course, the show is called Voices of Music Therapy, obviously referencing to the multiple people that you have on the show in that interview fashion so that they can speak about whatever topics are important to them or things that they specialize in. And I'm just curious how you landed on the name Voices of Music Therapy.
Choosing a name for anything is very difficult, whether a band, a song, a podcast. Knowing that this is something that I want to pursue for a long time made it even more difficult. I essentially was thinking about all these different names going through my head. And the reason I landed on Voices of Music Therapy was because we say music therapy oftentimes is like a person. But I want to show that music therapy can look so many different ways. And that's why it's voices. There's not one voice. There's not music therapy is. Music therapy can be. What if music therapy, there's all these terms. And I get the what if from a presentation I saw by Dr. Bill Matney, who we had on our second episode of the show. It allows us to rethink how we interpret music therapy and what it might look like. So that's why I said voices and acknowledging the backgrounds behind each individual on the show and how they culminate into this amazing opportunity to learn. Now, that's kind of my take on why I made the format the way that it is as far as who I interview, but I also want to talk about pretty much everything that involves the show. So you'll notice that there's also like branding things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my emotional connection and personal connection to the branding that we ended up choosing for the show. The first is the color that is based on a room in my grandfather's house. That's where you get kind of that like turquoisey color. And it's just a very nostalgic color of like, I don't know, the 70s, 60s. But this color kind of has that familial resemblance to me. And that my grandfather also really, really cared about showcasing others' voices and giving everybody equal opportunities. And so in the show, I wanted to reflect that through a little tribute to him by choosing that color. And in addition, you'll also notice that our logo has 3 diamonds on them, or 3 rhombuses. Or if you're going to get real technical, we have 3 squares turned on their side. But essentially, the idea behind this is to have the present, which is the center square, the past, which is the bottom one, and the future, which is on the top. So it's reflecting this process of our lives. We think about therapy and we think about our past selves and when we first started or when we were in training, and then the present selves, which could be just entering the field or have been in the field for 40 years, in the future and where we want to go. And I think to think of life in this like circular process is great, but then also to think of music therapy in the circular process. And it kind of replicates that continual assessment that happens in sessions where you think of what they've done before and how it's going to influence what they're doing in the session now and where you want to go with the session. So I find this 3 square system or 3 diamond really significant in that way. Now you'll also notice that if you go onto our Instagram or Facebook or anything like that, I began to update our highlights, and although these aren't fleshed out the way that I want them to be in the end, it's just a good starting point. So I'm trying to provide resources of other music therapy organizations for others to see, kind of continuing that design method. I have Asian resources, Latina resources, neurodiverse resources, Black resources, queer resources on our planet. So I'm just trying to provide all these things to everyone. And that's a big part of our branding as well, is just making things equitable. One of my most stressed things that you and I discussed, Alec, on the show was creating something for people who can't hear. Like if they're part of the hard of hearing or deaf community, how are they going to access our podcast? I mean, after all, it is auditory based. And so we did a lot of brainstorming and we ended up deciding that we're going to have a YouTube channel too, where there will be closed captioning. And that's really important to us, that this information is something that anybody can participate in. And yeah, that's a big part behind the branding of the show. And why I feel so connected to it and why it is just something that I love to do and love to share with you all.
Thank you. I really think that's cool, the way that you have it set up and the symbolism behind everything. As for the three squares, the past, present, and future, I think that's a really cool piece of symbolism to add. And kind of building off of that, you've mentioned all these great things that you've already been able to see come to fruition about, the captions and the accessibility, the resources. But since the podcast is also about moving forward and looking towards the future, is there anything that you have in mind that you'd like to implement going forward?
Oh gosh. So let me give you some context. Before I came into music therapy, like I was still in school, but I decided to pursue also a radio route. So there weren't classes for radio that I was aware of or had time for, but I joined our student ran radio. And so I had an interview show. And this is kind of where I got that like interview format. I interviewed individuals from different backgrounds and had them kind of explain their lives on the show live. And so that has definitely influenced where I wanted to go as well, because I saw so many different formats for shows, whether live, podcasts, etc. And so I think there are a lot of plans that are in my brain for where I want this podcast to go, and in your brain, Alec, because we've discussed them before. But what I want the listeners to know is that I am constantly thinking of ways to engage them actively. So whether that's through like a group episode that's live where you could ask your questions, like a TEDx talk virtually or something like that, or like it might be like live events eventually, because I used to do live event planning and what that might look like. So these are things running through my head. I'm not going to speak on them too much because they're not solidified or fully thought out yet, but these are just some like hints into my world and where I potentially see the show going.
Yeah, I definitely like the sound of a episode based around, answering questions from listeners and stuff like that. So if you're listening right now and have any questions for Brian or the show in general,
or Alec,
or me, yeah, feel free to leave those comments or questions on our social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. But yeah, if you would like to ask any questions about the show or anything for Brian or myself, feel free to leave those. We'd be happy to do an episode where Brian answers some questions for you. And so when it comes to these interviews and the guests that you bring on, what sort of thought process do you have when you're choosing a guest to bring onto the show?
Yeah, so I touched on this a little bit earlier, but essentially what I look for is people who are highly educated in the topic that they're discussing, innovators, leaders in the field. I want to make sure that I am able to accurately reflect the information they're saying through research. So I want to make sure that their research is accessible to me so that I can help others understand it better as well. And then third, I want to make sure that we have a variety of music therapists. I keep saying this because I really want to harp on this, is that although we have a majority identification or a majority identity within the field, I still think that it's important to hear from all those voices who aren't as well represented, whether in committees or in education. And this is how to do it.
Yeah, makes sense. And then for you personally, what is it like when you're trying to balance this lifestyle? Because you are a music therapist. That's first and foremost for your work. But then also being the host and producer and creator of this podcast, what is it like just to kind of balance those two and kind of bounce between the two styles of work?
It's a juggling game. I don't think that interviewing individuals is that different from therapy. And both I'm facilitating. But the only difference is we're not necessarily working towards a goal in our interviews other than providing information. Switching between those two identities can be tricky. Producing a show can be very difficult. Like I said, people have different timelines and lives, and coordinating with them can be very difficult on top of managing clients and coordinating their times. This is essentially a second job because I will get done with work and then I'll work on the podcast in whatever capacity that is, whether through social media promotion or through information that goes into our show notes or through figuring out who my next guest is going to be and honoring those who have already been interviewed on other shows. It's tough, but when you get to hear somebody's experience and them talk about something that they're truly, truly passionate about, because I don't tell them what we're going to talk about on our show. They tell me. It makes it very worthwhile and incredible in the way that in a session, you'll see your client finally achieves those goals, or those objectives that you've been working on for months.
Now, when you said you started going on to, the differences between a therapeutic session versus a podcast, and you said biggest difference is, and I definitely thought you were just going to talk about the fact that you're not broadcasting a therapeutic session.
Yeah, also that, HIPAA. But yeah, that is a big thing as well. And when you're in a podcast, you also have to think about how you speak and what you portray yourself as. Whereas in a session, it's not really, I'm conscious of those things to support our goals, but essentially it's much more self-centered and guest-centered. I don't know if that's fair to say, but.
Well, I mean, I know what you mean. It's not self-centered. It's just that, that's the context. That's the topic. It's when you're in a therapeutic session, you are addressing the client. It's all about the client. When you're in an interview like this, then yeah, it is about you because it's about the way you do your work and the experience that you have. And I don't think that's self-centered to say that, those are the differences. So you're a music therapist, a podcast host, not just the host, of course, you facilitate all of the interviews and getting everything prepped for that. And aside from those two very involved projects, what other ones are you working on? Because I know that you mentioned, working on music and a few other things. And I feel like I've known you long enough to know that you always have a multitude of things going on in your head, things that you want to make happen and see them come to fruition. So is there anything that you'd like to share with your listeners, things that you're excited about that are coming up?
Yeah, that's very true. I have a million things running through my mind constantly. One of the biggest things is written materials for you all, whether through continuing education or things that could be very beneficial to your sessions, like session materials. So I've been working on some of that. And I'm not going to speak too much on what they are because they're a surprise and there's a lot of logistics that I'm still juggling for those. So that, the music that I've been creating, and then I'm also juggling, I don't know. What else am I working on? I don't know if I'm creating anything else right now. I'm kind of keeping it focused for the most part. So those are the main things.
All right. Well, we are getting pretty close to the end of the show here. And before we sign off, Brian, would you like to share with everyone your information? We always end with, links and, social media, links for people to, find you. Is there anything that you'd like to share with them about how they can contact you if they have any questions, anything like that?
Absolutely. If you want to work together in some capacity as well, I'm always down to listen and hear from you and see what we can achieve together. You can reach me at my professional music therapy email at themusictherapyguy@gmail.com. Keep it kind of casual, but it's pretty straightforward too. You can also reach me on a more professional level at voicesmusictherapy@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Instagram, and I run the Instagram. So if you send a direct message, I will get it. It's just Voices of Music Therapy, one word. You can always search it in the search bar too. And you can reach out to us there. There are a bunch of ways to find me.
All right. Well, Brian, thank you. Thank you so much for giving us a little more insight into who you are. I think this is really a great concept for an episode to let the listeners know a little bit more about you, since, we haven't really had the chance to dive into that much. This was also pretty fun for me, a little chance to be in front of the microphone instead of behind it. That saying works a lot better with, behind the camera. But either way, this was excellent. I definitely had a good time, and I hope that you did as well, Brian, and everyone listening. I hope this was a fun episode for you.
Yeah, and if I can, I'd like to say one last thing to the listeners, and that is, it is very difficult to come on to any type of public platform and to discuss your identity, to discuss your background. And I just want you all to know that I'm honored that you are here to listen to others' backgrounds and their histories, and also that you have taken the time to listen to mine and to kind of hear some background behind the show. And I'll sprinkle some more background in as we continue our episodes, but know that every episode comes from a place of wanting to learn, wanting to showcase the differences in this world that make it so amazing, and also that this wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for you all listening. And that sounds cliche, but it's very true. You are the people that we are serving. And so if there's anything that you want at any time from this show, let us know. And we hear you and we support you. And that is our mission.
All right. Well, I think that was very beautifully said. I don't think we're going to get any better than that. So I think we're going to have to call it right there. Again, this was just a really fun exercise for both of us. So thank you all for listening and bearing with me as I try to host a podcast. Brian, you did an excellent job, and it is always fun working with you. I am looking forward to the next episodes that we do.
Yeah, me as well. Thank you. If you'd like to see today's guest or learn more about the show, check us out on Facebook or Instagram at Voices of Music Therapy, or on Twitter at VOMT Podcast. If you have any questions, or if you know any innovative music therapist and would like to recommend them for the show, you can email us at voicesofmusictherapy@gmail.com.